Good evening, everyone, and hope everybody's having a good week so far. We're going to dig into our topic and talk about your assignment. You're going to be talking about states' rights versus the federal government. And so I'm going to share my screen. I actually have two different presentations that I'll be going through with you tonight. And the first one, I'm going to let you guys kind of explore it on your own. Let me just share this and kind of give you an explanatory session here. Okay. So we've got levels of government, and you have several topics that you can choose from. You've got education, and let me go through all of these. Social welfare, national security, transportation, and the environment. And so what I've created here is a set of task cards. I use this for my in-seat students. And let me go back to the beginning. And so I've got various levels of government for each one, and I kind of give you an idea of what we're looking for when it says to choose an issue. You want to look at, federal, state, and local issues. So, for example, in education, you've got the U.S. Department of Education has launched a nationwide initiative to forgive student loan debt for public service workers. And so you could consider this as a group, or you could do it on your own. Just kind of think about whether this issue is best handled at the federal level. Could state or local governments address it differently, and what might be the consequences of the varying approaches? And then I've got other scenarios for other levels of government. You can kind of think of those. And I encourage you guys to navigate to whatever topic you've been assigned. I did have several questions about that today. So note that your topic is assigned in the weekly announcement. It's by the first letter of your last name. So you'll have to pop into the announcement and see which one you have. And then you can pull up this PowerPoint. I'll post it with the lecture, and you can go from there and take a look at all the potential issues that you have to deal with. And you don't have to choose one of these. Let me just say that. You do not have to choose one of these. You can choose something completely different because there's a lot of directions that you could go. But these just kind of give you a jumping off place in case you feel a little bit stuck. And so for this one, I did go deep into the federal level. So I talked about the federal initiative, student loan debt, and really just how essential it is to kind of combine student loan forgiveness with certain jobs like teaching, nursing, things like that. And, there's a real question here of should we look at this at the state level, because maybe certain states need more teachers, but they don't need as many nurses, or maybe they need criminal justice majors, or whatever it is. So, by allocating those funds, but then allowing the states to determine how to use them, can actually be more efficient than the federal government putting one standard on everyone as a whole when that standard may not apply in your area. And so those are the kind of things that I'm looking for with this particular paper. All right, so now we're going to get into the presentation. It is a little bit lengthy tonight, so I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible. Let me, actually, I got to stop sharing my screen and share the next presentation. Just a second here. All right, so we're going to talk about the Federalist Papers at length and then kind of get into some history. All right, so are you able to answer these questions? What were the main arguments for and against ratifying the Constitution? Which party insisted on adding the Bill of Rights to the Constitution, and why did they think that was important? And what difficulties were encountered during the process of ratification? So these are some things that we've talked about previously. Hopefully you can answer these questions. And if not, I encourage you to go back and explore the material to make sure you've got this down. The other question is, what's the basic structure of the Constitution? And this has been posted in the announcement, so hopefully you've seen it. This was a few weeks ago, actually, that I posted this. So you've got Article 1, doesn't start with the executive, right? Doesn't start with the president. You've got the legislative branch. Article 2 is executive. Article 3 is judicial. That's really where we're going to camp out on in this class for the most part. But then you've got Article 4, which is citizenship in new states. And remember, citizenship is more about your rights and responsibilities as a citizen. It's not how people become citizens, right? The naturalization process. New states being added into the Union, of course, we only had the land east of the Mississippi, and so all of those territories in the West had to have a way to become states, and so that's part of our Constitution. You've got the amendment process. Hopefully, you know amending means changing the Constitution. And then Article 6 is debts, supremacy, oaths, and religious tests. So basically, we said we're going to pay all of our debts, right? We had Revolutionary War debt that wasn't going so well. You had Shays' Rebellion and things like that. And so we said we're going to pay all that back. We're going to have integrity with that. We also said that the Constitution is supreme. The federal level is supreme, except anything that's not delegated in the Constitution reverts to the states. And then there's a clause that says there's no religious test to hold office, which we talked about that on the discussion board a little bit last week. I wasn't able to reply to some of you until Sunday. And so I encourage you to look back through last week's discussion and really filter that through the idea that there is a separation of church and state in this country and that there's no requirement, no religious requirement to hold office. And that's an essential, we're a nation founded on Protestantism, but, what if one Protestant denomination got into office in the early days and all of a sudden everyone had to be Methodist or everyone had to be Congregationalist or whatever it was, and that would just present a problem. And so that's one of the reasons we have the religious test clause in Article 6. And then you also have the ratification process, which is the process that made the Constitution a legal and binding document. All right, so who's who here? So we got Federalist. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay are all known as Publius in the Federalist Papers. You got property owners, landed rich merchants. The Federalists were sort of elitist, right? They believed in elitism. They saw themselves and those of their class as most fit to govern. They had a powerful central government, a bicameral legislature, which means two houses. That's the Senate and the House of Representatives. They wanted representative democracy with single representatives for 30,000 people. On the anti-federalist side, you of course have Thomas Jefferson. You also have Brutus and Cato. These folks were small farmers and shopkeepers, laborers. They believed in the decency of the common man and in participatory democracy. They viewed elites as corrupt and they sought greater protection of individual rights. They wanted stronger state governments at the expense of the federal government, frequent elections, smaller districts, and more direct democracy. All right, so quick path to ratification. So in December of 1787, you have Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey ratifying. Then you have in February of 1788, Massachusetts ratifying, New Hampshire and Virginia in June, and that's enough to bring the government into effect. Then you have New York in July. Americans voted in the first election, and Washington is elected president in 1789. North Carolina ratifies in 1789, and Rhode Island in 1790. And in December of 1791, the Bill of Rights became part of the Constitution. So, nice little roadmap there. New York ratified the Constitution by a vote of 30 to 27, which was the narrowest margin of victory of any state that met in 1787 and 88. And of course, the Federalist Papers were written in New York. There's a reason they were written in New York because you see this narrow margin of victory. Well, how much of that was actually due to the publication of the Federalist Papers? So the Anti-Federalists, of course, are responsible for the Bill of Rights, which was ratified in 1791. And there was a real question about how much government was actually needed, how big should it be? The central debate even today, the size and scope of government. And you could almost argue, you could argue that American history, in terms of political history, is really a vision of competing governments. It's states' rights versus the federal government all throughout since the founding. And there's a real question of who should regulate what. And so the Constitution had to be strong enough to promote commerce and protect rights. It had to prevent the threat of excess democracy, ensure widespread support for ratification. There had to be separation of powers and federalism to restrict the government's power. And so there's a pretty famous phrase. Benjamin Franklin is recorded as having walked out of one of the constitutional meetings, and a woman is standing on the steps, and she asked him, "What have you wrought?" And he answered, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." And, there have been a good many books and gifs and memes, things like that, based on this phrase, if you can keep it. Eric Metaxas has a book entitled "If You Can Keep It." We use it for CCU, for CAGS, the adult and graduate studies. That's the book that we use for American exceptionalism. And so it's a great book, really digs deep into the unique aspects of a republic and why a republic is fragile and why it takes effort to preserve it. So, in September of 1787, the Congress of the Confederation submitted the newly adopted Constitution to the 13 states for ratification. The Congress neither endorsed nor opposed it. And after this, two factions developed. So you have the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. And some people call them parties. I personally like the term factions. I don't think we had parties quite yet, although they did develop into parties. And so it depends in the eye of the beholder how you see that. But that's kind of where the Federalist Papers are really in support of federalism. They're in support of a strong central government. And so, what were the Federalist Papers, right? You guys are reading them. They've been in your assigned reading and study material, so I hope that you've read some of them. I'm going to take just a minute and go through the first 10 of them and just kind of give you an idea of what the arguments were and just really summarize it very briefly, but hopefully it will put this into perspective for you guys. So, the Federalist Papers were a collection of 85 newspaper articles published in New York that were written in defense of the Constitution. They were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay under the pen name Publius, which means the people. They explain why a strong federal government would benefit the people of America. And so, opponents of the Constitution were known as anti-federalists. They were very supportive of states' rights. And so Federalist One, the first article, it's written by Alexander Hamilton, and pay attention to these dates, October 27th, 1787. So Hamilton asked whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing a good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend on their political constitutions on accident and force. And Hamilton prepares for negative arguments, and that's something that you should also consider as you guys draft your papers this week. Consider as you make your arguments for which level of government is best equipped to handle your issue. And what are the counter arguments to that? If someone was going to oppose you and say it should be the opposite way, what would they say and why? And that's sort of what Hamilton does here. He's preparing for those negative arguments so that he can debate the opposing side. And he ponders the reasons for opposition, and he concludes that some are noble and others are not. Now, the second article was written by John Jay on October 31st, 1787. Now, Jay points out that some politicians thought it would be better to separate the Union into 13 individual sovereign states because of the failure of the Articles of Confederation. Jay argues that the country and the people seem to have been made for each other. The geography of America, he says, favors the Union. And so it is interesting, a lot of countries form because of geographic boundaries like mountains and rivers and things like that. And we do have sort of a cohesive geography all up on the eastern side. And so you can kind of see where he's going with that. But again, pay attention to these dates. These articles are written just days apart, right? So you have October 27th was the first one, October 31st is the second one. And then you have November 3rd, and they keep coming out like this, and so the idea here is that they're trying to get people's attention, right? Kind of like those emails that you get, maybe you get a spam email from something and you ignore it the first time or the second time, and by the third time you're like, okay, I'll respond, or maybe I'll look into that or whatever. And so that's kind of how this went. And maybe if people didn't read Federalist 1, 2, or 3, maybe they did read 5 or 6 or 7, and then they started to see, oh, these people actually have a point, right? They're actually so, and obviously this worked because New York did ratify eventually, right? And that's the idea here is to consider opposing arguments because a lot of people in New York were opposed to a strong central government. They wanted the articles to be corrected, not changed. And so, when you take the time to listen to other arguments, sometimes that can be extremely beneficial and give you new perspectives that maybe you didn't have before. And so that's what's going on here. And so you get into Federalist 3, and the article argues that the people will be safer with a great union of states. They would have more protection against foreign powers, and border states would probably have problems with the French and Spanish territories. They said it would prevent war with each other, and that sustaining a union is in the best interest of all people. So then you have Federalist 4, and so John Jay publishes this on November 7th. He continues to speak of safety, and he lists several reasons why war might occur. He says that if foreign nations realize that the national government is efficient, that trade is regulated properly, and that finances are managed well, they will probably want to be friends with the United States. And that's good, right? We want to have build good relationships with all the countries overseas so that maybe if we do need money, they'll loan us money. If we need help, they'll help us be our ally and just maintain those good relationships as a new country. And so Federalist 5 is written by John Jay. It's published on November 10th, 1787. Jay argues that dividing the House into several confederacies or states would lead to jealousy, discord, and mutual injury. And he uses the history of Britain and Spain as a case in point. Then you have Federalist number 6. Now, this is November 14th, so we're moving on here. Hamilton builds on Jay's work by offering more examples of nations that went to war. He talks about Athens, Sparta, Rome, Venice, England under Henry VIII, and others. And finally, he argues that Shays' rebellion proves his point. So you get to Federalist 7, he continues to build on these points, and he says the problems that have already risen are evidence that a weak central government simply won't work. The public debt of the Union would be a further cause of collision between the states and the confederacies. Federalist 8, also written by Hamilton on November 20th. Now he's looking at standing armies. What would happen if the states were disunited and they suddenly needed a large standing army? So again, going back to the original arguments, imagine if our country was founded on 13 individual states versus like no overarching government to unite them, and they had a need to go to war. That could be potentially extremely detrimental. And so that's sort of what he's talking about here. You get into Federalist 9, and then he's talking about the anti-federalists. They believe that republicanism was not a peaceful form of government, and that his proposal would only work in small regions. In other words, we're too large of an area. It'll never work here. And he says, yes, it will. Look at separation of powers. Let's read Montesquieu and really get into some of those ideas. Now, Federalist 10 is an essential, and if you don't read any others in its entirety, I highly encourage you to read Federalist 10, although there are others I encourage you to read as well, but since I'm only doing through the first 10 here, I'll kind of camp out on this one. This one has to deal with factions, and factions are interest groups, essentially. Ideas that a lot of people follow, and they kind of divide society, and we see a lot of that going on in our country today and all throughout history. I mean, if you go back and you read ancient Roman documents, the historian Sallust, he talks about factions, and he talks about how factions were detrimental to ancient Israel and how it led to the downfall of Israel in 70 AD under the Romans. But this really talks about federalism and liberty, right? So you're looking at how, in a federalist society, how are you going to preserve liberty if factions arise? And he says, well, there's two ways of dealing with them. You can eliminate them, or you can control their effects. And if you eliminate them, then you have essentially squelched liberty. You have to allow people to believe what they want to believe. Like ideological freedom is extremely important, right? Nobody wants to be told what to believe, but that's what happened under the monarchy all throughout history. Whatever the religion of the king and queen was, is what the people were expected to be. And it led to a lot of religious wars and things like that, martyrdom, massacres. It was brutal, right? And so, that's why freedom of religion is one of our most essential freedoms, because it's essentially ideological freedom, and it is important. Okay, so the Federalist Papers are important to us today for many, many reasons. These men thought deeply about why a federal government would be the best thing for the people. They're a classic. Lawyers use them to interpret various court cases and things like that. And so, as an American citizen, it's our duty to understand our nation's founding documents. And the Constitution is certainly one, and the Federalist Papers are almost like a commentary on the Constitution if you really want to understand what the founders thought about the Constitution, how they wanted it to be interpreted, you can read the Federalist Papers and get a pretty good idea of that. All right, so now that is federalism at the founding. Now, federalism has changed over time. You have an evolution of federalism, and I'm going to go through this. I'm not going to have time to finish this entire presentation because it takes me, when I do this for my in-seat students, it takes me about an hour to get through it. So I'm going to post this for you guys and let you go through it on your own, but I'm going to cover the basics and hit the highlights for you. So we've got dual federalism. That's basically like a layer cake. So kind of what you see in the picture over here, it's a clear separation of powers. And so, where the federal, state, and local levels all have their niche things that they do, and they carry it out with certain nuances. Cooperative federalism is a marble cake. So you guys have probably seen a marble cake. It's sort of like all swirls together. And that's where federalism, the boundaries are not quite as well defined as they are under dual federalism. You also have new federalism, which is, that happened under the Nixon Reagan, Nixon administration first. You have decentralization, where, things begin to separate out again. And then you have post 9/11 federalism, where you have renewed federal power. So let's talk about what each of those looks like practically. So Herbert Hoover is responsible, or not responsible for the Great Depression, but a lot of political analysts and historians love to point the finger and say Hoover sort of tanked the Republican Party, which then paved the way for FDR to come in as a four-term president. And so FDR was very unique because he had polio, he was in a wheelchair, and he was the only president to serve 4 terms, which we can't, that doesn't happen anymore because we have an amendment limiting the president to 2 terms. But during the first 100 days, Roosevelt was applauded by nearly everyone, even conservatives, because he saved the old banking system, he cut government spending, and he struck at prohibition. And prohibition, as you know, and you should know, is the sale of alcohol. And so the New Deal programs really changed society. It changed the way that we looked at the role of the federal government. And given the time period, a lot of them were very positive. They're very controversial, though. Some people really don't like them. And so it depends on which side of the spectrum you fall. Um, you know, the idea here is that you're coming out of the Great Depression, you're coming out of World War II, and you have a lot of widows because their husbands have died in the war. You have people who are just starving. You have people coming out of concentration camps. And so this was the age when welfare really became a government funded thing. And so the New Deal, it's not just welfare though, and you'll see this as I go through it. You've got FDIC, which is insurance for the banks. You've got the CCC, which really benefited people in rural areas who were financially struggling. You have the Securities and Exchange Commission and Social Security Administration under all of these things. And so basically, this allowed the government to help people in these ways, but it also gave the federal government more authority than it had before. And so, like I said, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of the abbreviated version. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can take a look if you would like, maybe pause the video, or I'm going to post the PowerPoint. You can go through it yourself. According to not your textbook, but another textbook that I use, federal involvement helps ensure uniform public services across wealth disparities. All right, so new federalism, what is that? So that's really based on Keynesian theory. And I kind of like studying economic theories. I find them very fascinating. And so prior to 1960, almost everyone was in agreement that the government should maintain a balanced budget except in times of war. But Keynesian theory sort of changed all of this. It looks like Keynesian theory, right? It's pronounced Keynesian. And since my last name is Key, I can tell you the reason why. It's because if you take it all the way way back to the original key people. They were dock workers. I think they were from Scotland, and it was pronounced K, and it was spelled Kay. And somewhere along the way, it morphed and it became key, and so that's where we get Keynesian. But the namesake is John Maynard Keynes, and you can see his last name also looks like Keynes or something like that. So, but John Maynard Keynes lived during the Great Depression, and he developed a plan for economic recovery. Actually, FDR was a Keynesian, although he looked at a lot of other things as well. I think Basil Blackett's book was of great interest to him. You can look that up if you want. But Keynesian was a major theory. And so during the 1940s and 50s, after FDR has left office, there's a real question of what they're going to do with these New Deal policies. Are they going to keep them or change them or what? And so the Keynesian view became even more popular. It freed the constraints of maintaining a balanced budget, and it allowed politicians to spend more than they could tax. Now, between 1960 and 2015, the federal budget ran 51 deficits and 4 surpluses. So the idea here is that you are allowed to run a deficit as long as you pay that deficit back when you have a surplus, right? And so I don't know, maybe you've embraced a little bit of Keynesian theory in your own world, and sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't because the surpluses can be a little bit unpredictable. And so the idea here, though, is that we actually did relatively well with this. We didn't rack up the national debt really until we got into the 2000s. So it's amazing how long we were able to run on this particular economic theory. And so the surpluses by 2010, we got to 10% of the GDP. By 2023, we were at 93%, and it's even higher than that today. So again, you guys can pause and read some of these. There's a fun little bringing the budget under control. I will read this. So there's a great book if you want to understand economic theory. It's called Common Sense Economics. And there's a question of why do 435 representatives and 100 senators have such a difficult time bringing the budget under control? And so the answer is suppose that 535 individuals go out to dinner and they know that they're only going to have to pay a fraction of the cost, 1/535th. Well, nobody is going to be compelled to order less because the cost to them is so negligible. However, if everybody orders up, then the bill is going to go up exponentially. And that's sort of what you have going on. And when you read the book, he's talking about campaign promises and things like that. All the things that our candidates promise to us are going to cost money. And then if they do follow through on their promises and the taxpayer has to pay that cost, then they may not be reelected again. And so the other way is to borrow to meet those obligations of the things that they said they would do. And so it's kind of interesting how all of that plays out in the campaign process. And so you also have Lyndon B. Johnson. He is responsible for the Great Society legislation. And there's a, he took some of FDR's policies and changed them a little bit, which then created sort of a shift in what was going on between the federal and the state level of government. And again, I will not read all of this to you guys. You guys can go through it. Reagan, of course, is known for Reaganomics. And we also call that supply side economics. And if you're not a fan of Reagan, you might call that trickle down economics. But again, Reagan, Nixon are sort of in the same boat in terms of states' rights and the federal government. So I'll let you guys read through that. Major court cases, United States v. Lopez is one. You might want to be familiar with that particular case. And I'm really going to go into federalism after 9/11 for a minute. So basically, you have a centralization of power that happened again. And so the terrorist attacks of September 11th triggered a major shift towards federal authority, stronger federal authority. And you have new agencies that developed, like the Department of Homeland Security. You also have the Transportation Security Administration. You have expanded federal mandates and state and federal tension coming out of this. The Patriot Act was a major player. It was created after 9/11, and that's been very controversial ever since because there's a question about government surveillance and privacy and things like that. How far do we go to prevent terrorism? All right, so that concludes. I think I'm going to end it here. I appreciate you guys watching to the end. If you have any questions, reach out. I'm always here to help you, and I hope y'all have a wonderful week.